In January of 1990, 39-year-old Marlene Warren made her way across her sprawling backyard in Wellington, Florida. Marlene and her husband Michael were hosting a barbecue for some of their friends and family and coworkers. And so far, the Florida winter weather had not disappointed. It was sunny and about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, so a perfect day for an outdoor party. Marlene looked down and checked the food on the grill. It smelled delicious and was almost ready to be served. Then she looked up and saw all the people in her yard who were talking and laughing and having a great time, and she smiled. Her backyard, and really her entire house, were made for big parties like this one. Where Marlene lived, Wellington, Florida, was a small upscale village not far from West Palm Beach that was filled with mansions and golf courses. Marlene and Michael's 5-bedroom home was over 5,000 square feet, it had a pool, and it even had an attached airplane hangar for Michael's prop plane. Marlene enjoyed the luxury that her house and her neighborhood provided, but really what she loved the most was all the space she had on her property so she could throw these big parties for all the people she loved. The smell of the food drifted across the backyard, and after a while, a few guests began heading towards the grill. And amongst those guests were a young couple, Sheila and Richard Keene, who walked up and asked Marlene if she needed any help. But Marlene said she had everything under control, and really she was just happy that Sheila and Richard had made it to the party. Sheila and Richard both worked for Marlene's husband, Michael, at the used car dealership that he owned, and so Marlene was just happy to meet some of these people that spent so much time with her husband. Sheila and Richard chatted for a little bit longer, and then they turned and headed back towards the party, at which point Marlene began taking the food off the grill and putting them out on serving dishes. As soon as Marlene's 21-year-old son, Joey, and a few of his friends saw Marlene putting the food out, they rushed over and grabbed some paper plates and began piling them full of food. Joey's father, Marlene's husband, Michael, spotted the boys doing what they were doing, and he laughed and told them to please save some food for the other guests. Then Michael walked over to the grill and put his arm around Marlene, and she leaned her head on his shoulder. Both of them had been so busy with work lately that it felt like they barely got any time together. So it was nice now to have a moment to relax together and just to enjoy the company of their friends and family. Marlene and Michael had been together for almost 18 years, and even though things weren't always perfect, Marlene couldn't imagine her life without her husband. Back in the mid-1960s, Marlene had gotten married to a different man. She gave birth to her first son at the age of 16, and she had Joey a few years later when she was 19. But not long after that, her first husband had died, and Marlene felt completely lost. She was now a widow at just 20 years old, and she was trying to raise 2 young boys all on her own. At the time, she had gotten a lot of support from her parents, but there were still moments when she just felt like surviving was almost impossible. Then she had met Michael, and it was like everything in her life got better. Michael was kind, he was handsome, he was driven to succeed, and he almost immediately became this loving father figure to Marlene's 2 boys. And Michael was just as taken with Marlene as she was with him. He thought she was absolutely stunning with her beautiful red hair and blue eyes, but more importantly, he thought of Marlene as being a really strong person who had managed to overcome this terrible tragedy, losing her first husband at such a young age. And so clearly Marlene was just this really mature person. And also, Michael really liked how driven Marlene was to succeed, just like he was. Marlene and Michael had gotten married in 1972, and they eventually moved to Florida. They started a real estate business that Marlene ran, and over the years, they'd come to own multiple rental properties. Michael had also opened up a used car dealership that specialized in selling and renting cars to people who struggled to get loans because of their credit. And ultimately, both the real estate and car business had taken off in ways that not even Marlene and Michael had seen coming. And so they ended up making millions and millions of dollars between them and then buying their beautiful home here in Wellington. In the backyard, Marlene and Michael stepped away from the grill and mingled with their guests. Marlene said she was glad people from different aspects of their life, friends, family, and work, all seemed to be getting along so well. Then Marlene and Michael split up to cover more ground and to see if any of their guests needed anything. A little while later, Marlene went back to the grill to cook more food, and her mother-in-law approached her. Marlene had a great relationship with Michael's mom, and they always had plenty to talk about, but her mother-in-law had a serious look on her face, so Marlene asked if everything was okay. Her mother-in-law leaned in, like she was about to tell Marlene some big secret. Then she just pointed toward some of Michael's employees, Sheila and Richard Keene, the 2 that Marlene had spoken to at the grill earlier, and in a quiet voice, she told Marlene to watch out for Sheila because she was young and pretty. Marlene understood that her mother-in-law was just trying to help. They both knew Michael could be a bit of a flirt, but Marlene wasn't too worried about anything like that. And so she ended up not really saying anything back to her mother-in-law after she made this comment, but inside, if she was going to worry about either of the Keens, it would not be Sheila, it would be Richard. Richard had a bit of a shady past. He'd faced weapons possession and drug charges with the police, and he worked for Michael as a repo man, which meant he took cars back from people when they were behind on payments. It was a difficult job, and a lot of people did not want to give up their cars, but Richard was known as a tough guy who people did not want to mess with. And so no matter how much people fought him, he would get them to give up their cars. Still, Marlene was not about to hold anybody's past against them. She knew Richard was one of Michael's hardest working employees, and the two men, Michael and Richard, really seemed to get along well, so if Marlene's husband trusted him, then she did too. The party lasted into the night, and by the time the final guests left, Marlene felt exhausted but really happy. The barbecue had clearly been a success. Inside the house, she and Michael sat down on the couch and put their feet up. Michael looked over at his wife and said, "Hey, pretty soon we're going to have to start thinking about our next party, your 40th birthday." Marlene laughed because her 40th birthday was still almost 5 months away, but Michael said it was never too early to start thinking about it. After all, turning 40 was kind of a big deal. Marlene and Michael sat and talked a bit longer. Then Michael said he was tired and kissed his wife and headed to bed. Marlene stayed in the living room by herself, and as she sat there, it really hit her that she was going to turn 40 soon. Now, there was a time when she would have seen that as getting old, and she would have dreaded the birthday, but Marlene actually felt kind of excited for her birthday. For her age, she had actually accomplished a ton. She had the kind of life that people envied, and she believed that everything would just keep on getting better as she got older. About 6 months later, at around 11 a.m. on Saturday, May 26, 1990, Marlene was cooking food again. This time, though, she was in the kitchen making breakfast for her son Joey and two of his friends who were over at the house. Marlene finished up the food and then hollered for the boys to come and get it. Joey and his two friends rushed into the kitchen, they got their breakfast, and then went back into the living room to keep watching TV. Marlene was happy to have a relaxing weekend ahead of her. A little bit earlier, Michael had headed out to a racetrack in Miami with a friend about 70 miles away, so Marlene was totally solo, and she figured she might just spend the day driving around. Michael had surprised her for her 40th birthday with her dream car, a candy apple red Firebird. Marlene loved this sports car, and today felt like the perfect day to go out for a drive. But before she could head outside to hop in her car, the doorbell rang. Marlene was pretty sure her son and his friends were not going to get up to answer the door, so she headed to the front door and she opened it up. And as soon as she did, Marlene smiled, because standing there was a clown. It was this person in a clown costume with a curly red wig and white makeup, and this clown was holding balloons and a small picnic basket filled with flowers in one of their hands. At this point, Joey and his friends looked up from the couch towards the door, and when they saw the clown, they just started laughing. They wondered why there was a clown at the house, but they quickly turned back to the TV. As for Marlene, she figured these balloons and flowers must be some sort of late birthday present, or just a kind of random nice surprise from Michael. The clown grinned and handed the balloons and flowers to Marlene. Marlene said, "Oh, these are so pretty," and then began looking for a card to see who had sent this to her. But as she did this, Marlene didn't notice the clown pulled their other hand out from behind their back. And then a second later, in the living room, Marlene's son Joey suddenly heard a loud pop, and then he turned and looked towards the front door, and he saw the clown had turned and begun running away from the house, and his mother was now lying on the floor. Joey and his friends had no idea what just happened, but they ran over to Marlene's side, and right away they saw her face was covered in blood. She had been shot. The boys ran out the door screaming for this clown and screaming for help, and then at the end of the road, they saw a white Chrysler sedan called a LeBaron racing away around the corner. And so one of Joey's friends rushed back inside to call 911. Joey ran straight for his car, he hopped inside and began flying down the road after this Chrysler. But Joey, after turning the corner and driving all around the neighborhood, he could not find the white Chrysler LeBaron. It was gone. Not long after the 911 call, Detective Michael Harrison of the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department arrived outside of Marlene's house. When Harrison had first gotten the call to investigate a shooting carried out by a clown in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the county, He wondered if he was hearing everything right, or if maybe a fellow officer was playing some sort of twisted joke on him. But Harrison quickly realized this was not a joke. After being shot, Marlene had been rushed to the hospital, and she was now fighting for her life. All Harrison knew about the person who had shot her was that they were last seen wearing a clown costume. Harrison walked towards Marlene's property. Officers who had arrived first on the scene had already cordoned off the yard with police tape, and out front they had gathered Joey, his two friends, and a neighbor who had heard the shooting while he was out walking his dog. Joey and his friends stood there with police, still in total shock. Joey's hands trembled, and the first thing he told Detective Harrison was that he'd gone after the shooter, but he had failed to catch them. Harrison did his best to calm Joey down. He knew this young man really just wanted to go to the hospital to see his mom, and Harrison also knew that the chaos of what had just happened would just make it really difficult for Joey to focus. But Joey and his friends were Harrison's best witnesses, and so he hoped he could get at least some information out of them right now. So Harrison asked Joey if there was anything he remembered about the shooter beyond them being dressed as a clown. After taking a deep breath and collecting himself, Joey would say that the shooter had a lot of white makeup on, like even more makeup than a circus clown would wear, so as a result, it was almost impossible to tell what the shooter actually looked like. But Joey said, as far as he could tell, the shooter was a man who was probably about 5'9" tall, and he had what looked like really big hands. Joey's friends would agree with that description. Detective Harrison said this was extremely helpful, and then he asked them if there was anything else they remembered. Joey just shook his head, and his friends said that was all they could think of. But then, Joey looked up at Harrison like something had just come back to him. He said there actually was one thing that really stood out, but he hadn't really thought about it at the time. Joey said when the clown came to the door, there was a part of his costume that seemed a bit off. Instead of wearing the typical oversized clown shoes, this clown was wearing black combat boots. This was an interesting piece of information, but it didn't really surprise Harrison. The detective figured the shooter had planned this whole shooting out, and they knew they would need to make a quick getaway, and trying to run back to their car in giant clown shoes would have been very difficult. Harrison thanked Joey and his friends for their help, and as they walked away, Harrison just could not imagine what Joey must have felt witnessing his mother get shot like that right in front of him. Harrison walked over to the neighbor who had been out walking his dog at the time of the shooting. The man would tell Harrison that he only heard a single gunshot. He also said he was sure the shooter had sped off in a white Chrysler LeBaron that didn't have a license plate. Harrison thanked the neighbor, and then he made one of the weirdest phone calls he'd ever made in his entire law enforcement career. He contacted the sheriff's department and asked them to issue a BOLO, which is a be on the lookout message to other law enforcement agencies and the general public. Harrison said the BOLO should let people know they were searching for a white Chrysler LeBaron that was being driven by a clown. Harrison made his way inside of Marlene's house, and right away he was stunned at just how little evidence there was, considering a shooting had taken place right there. There was very minimal blood in the entryway, and there were no bullet casings, no weapon, and no bullet holes in the wall. Harrison still needed to get some information from the hospital where Marlene had been taken, but based on his conversation with the neighbor, and also based on what he saw at the crime scene, Harrison's first impression of this crime was that the clown, the shooter, fired one bullet, and that bullet must be lodged somewhere in Marlene's body. The lack of ballistics evidence and the fact that the shooter was fully disguised meant that Harrison and his team did not have a lot to go on. But he crouched down in the entryway and focused on the evidence he did have, the balloons and the basket of flowers. One of the balloons was pretty generic, but the other one was red, heart-shaped, and had a message on it that said, "You're the greatest." For now, that balloon was the best clue Harrison had. So he instructed his team to cover every place in the area that sold balloons to see which of those places sold heart-shaped balloons like the one left behind at the scene. Harrison's team worked fast, and his tactic paid off. Later that day, he learned there was only one grocery store in town that sold that particular balloon. So Harrison had his first major break in his search for the clown who had shot Marlene. Members of the investigative team went to the grocery store where they believed the balloon left at Marlene's house had come from, and one of the clerks there remembered selling the balloon and flowers to someone about an hour and a half before Marlene was shot. Now, the clerk could not provide a description of the person who bought these items, but this information was still very valuable because now Detective Harrison thought there was a strong possibility that their shooter, the clown, was somebody local, that they would have known to come to this particular grocery store to get that particular balloon and those flowers. And so with that theory in mind, that their shooter was local, Harrison turned his attention to local costume shops. If the shooter purchased the balloons and flowers in town, then they very likely got their clown costume locally too. And later that day, a bell jangled over Harrison's head when he walked through the door of a small, dimly lit costume shop. He walked past shelves of masks and racks filled with all different kinds of costumes, and at the back of the shop, he found two young women sitting behind a large glass counter that had costume makeup displayed in it. Harrison introduced himself to the young women, and they were clearly very surprised to see a detective in their store. Harrison told them they had nothing to worry about and that he just had a couple of basic questions for them. Then he asked both of them if they recalled selling a clown costume recently. The women looked at each other and their eyes went wide. Then one of the young women turned back to Harrison and told him they'd actually just been talking about a clown costume that they had sold a couple of nights earlier. She said the costume itself was not the weird part, it was the customer who bought it that made the whole transaction so strange. She said this customer had come into the shop while they were locking up for the night, and so the women had told this customer they were closed, but this person said they were desperate to get a clown costume, and they had to have it right now. The young women could tell this customer seemed very, very anxious and on edge, and so ultimately they decided to help. They walked the customer to the back of the store and showed them the clown costumes they had, and eventually the customer found the costume they liked, and they also bought a red curly wig, a clown nose, and a bunch of white makeup. Harrison asked if this customer had also bought clown shoes, and one of the women said actually that was another interesting thing about this transaction. The customer had been so adamant that they wanted a full clown costume, but then when it was time to actually get the clown costume, they said they did not want the shoes that came with it. So Harrison asked for a description of this customer. But both women said, it was the strangest thing. When this customer came in, it was like they already were in disguise because they had a hat pulled down over their face and they had their jacket pulled up high around their neck and they kept looking down and barely speaking. And so, the two women just did not have a clue what this person looked like. They couldn't really even tell if it was a man or a woman. But what they could recall was that this person was maybe 5'8" or 5'9", and they appeared to have some brown hair, but they didn't know how long it was. While this description obviously was not very helpful, it did kind of match the description that Marlene's son, Joey, had given of the clown that shot his mother. He basically described an average-sized man, and that seemed like that's what the customer was. Harrison hoped this customer had bought the clown stuff using a credit card, and then he could just kind of follow the credit card transaction history right to the shooter. But unfortunately, when he asked the women for the credit card receipt, they said that the customer had paid in cash, and so there was no paper trail. So Harrison thanked the two young women for their time, and then he headed back outside and made his way back to the sheriff's department. The next day, so May 27th, 1990, the day after the shooting, Detective Harrison led Marlene's husband, Michael, into a small office at the sheriff's station. Michael looked dazed and like he hadn't slept in a long time. The day before, Michael had been halfway to Miami when he got a call on his car phone. That was how he had learned his wife had been shot. Michael had turned around immediately and sped to the hospital to be with Marlene, and he had stayed with Marlene the entire time until Harrison had asked him to come to the sheriff's station. Harrison sat down across from Michael. The detective knew Michael had an airtight alibi, having been on the road when the shooting took place, but when a violent crime is committed, spouses are often the first suspect. So even if Michael didn't pull the trigger, Harrison could not yet rule out that he was involved in some way. And even if Michael wasn't connected to the shooting, Harrison hoped Michael could provide some key information that might push the investigation forward. Harrison asked Michael if he had any idea who would want to hurt his wife, but Michael looked like he barely even heard the question. He just said he wished the shooter had gotten him instead of Marlene. He said she was such a good person and everybody loved her. Detective Harrison said he understood how hard this was for Michael, but he asked the question again. Did he know of anybody who might want to hurt his wife? Michael finally slumped over and he rubbed his eyes. He took a minute to either think or collect himself, and then he looked back up at Harrison. Michael said the only thing he could think of had to do with his and Marlene's real estate business. They had several rental properties, and periodically they would have to evict people from these properties. And because Marlene managed the real estate business, she was the one who handled these evictions. And people who get evicted don't like being evicted. There's lots of opportunity for conflict. So Michael thought it was possible that maybe an angry former tenant who had been evicted by Marlene had attacked Marlene to get some kind of revenge on her for getting kicked out of their apartment. That made sense to Harrison, and so he made a note to have his team look into all the people Marlene had evicted over the years. Then he asked Michael if he and his wife had been fighting recently or if their marriage was strained in any way. Michael said he would do anything for his wife, and vice versa. He said sure, they argued like any married couple did, but it was usually just over small stuff, and they always made up, and they loved each other. Then Michael told Harrison that what he really wanted right now was just to be back at the hospital with his wife. Harrison nodded and thanked Michael for coming to the station, and then let him leave to go back to his wife. Later that day, members of Harrison's team started tracking down the names and locations of the people who Marlene had evicted, and who might, because of that eviction, have a grudge against her. And Detective Harrison reached out to Marlene's friends and family to see if they might know something that Michael was unaware of or forgot to mention. And in doing that, Harrison got one piece of information that completely threw him for a loop. Apparently, Marlene loved clowns. Marlene's parents told Harrison that when Marlene was little, she had clown decorations all over her room and she was always drawing pictures of clowns, and they said this love of clowns did not go away when Marlene got older. She would still get very excited if she saw a clown or if she heard the circus was in town. And so Detective Harrison still thought looking into disgruntled former tenants made a lot of sense, but this new information sparked a different idea about the case for him. Had someone who knew Marlene really well tried to kill her dressed up as the one thing that she loved? Who would do that? It's so dark and twisted. The following day, so May 28th, 2 days after the shooting, Marlene's family made the heartbreaking decision to take Marlene off of life support, and so Marlene passed away in the hospital. It was Memorial Day, and Marlene's son, Joey, knew it was the kind of holiday that his mom would have loved to celebrate by hosting another big backyard barbecue for her friends and family. Joey had held on to hope that his mom would survive this ordeal, but now that she was gone, Joey just felt lost. The family dealt with the shock of losing a wife, mother, and child, and at the same time, Detective Harrison now knew he had a homicide case on his hands. But at least he felt like he had a few decent leads. For example, his team was able to locate all the people Marlene had evicted, so Harrison pursued the idea that this could have been a grudge killing. But Harrison found himself feeling more surprised after he spoke to each of these evicted former tenants. Even though Marlene had kicked them out of their apartments, they all still spoke very fondly of her. They said she was a genuinely good person and a decent landlord. Some said they had even remained friends with Marlene after they had been evicted. Harrison couldn't actually rule any of them out yet, but during all those interviews with these former tenants, he never felt like he was talking to a killer. Then, on May 30th, so 4 days after the shooting, Harrison got a major break in the case. The white Chrysler LeBaron car, the car the clown had jumped into and sped off in that Joey had chased after and couldn't find, well, that car was found. A little after 9:30 a.m., Detective Harrison and county forensics investigators arrived at a grocery store parking lot where the car had been abandoned. The car didn't have any license plates on it, so instead, Harrison called in the vehicle identification number, or VIN number, that's assigned to every vehicle, and you can find it typically on the inside of your car door. He called that number in to his department so they could begin to try to look it up, at the same time that the forensics team began to comb through this car to look for evidence. And at some point, one of the forensics investigators who was in the driver's side of the car called out to Harrison, and so Harrison walked over to the driver's door, and the investigator pointed out red fibers on the door, and then showed Harrison that more of those same red fibers had been found in the driver's seat. They would need to run tests to confirm this, but everybody at the scene felt confident those red fibers must have come from the red clown wig the shooter was seen wearing. The forensics investigators continued their sweep of the car, and they would also find 2 strands of brown hair. They bagged the red fibers and brown hair as evidence, and then prepared them to be sent off to an FBI crime lab to be analyzed. At the time, DNA testing was still in its early days, and so hair analysis was also very limited. The FBI had greater testing capabilities than the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department, but Harrison knew there was still no guarantee that these hair samples would actually lead him anywhere. Still, they had a car that matched the description of the one that had been seen speeding away from the crime scene, and they had red fibers that could match the description of the red clown wig, and Harrison believed the shooter had brown hair based on the description he'd gotten from the two young women at the costume shop, and they had those brown hairs that were found in the car. So it seemed clear to Harrison that they had found the shooter's car, and he wouldn't have to wait for the FBI's test results to find a connection between that car and the victim. Police ran that vehicle identification number, and they discovered that the LeBaron was a rental car, and about a month earlier, it had been returned to the used car dealership that Marlene's husband, Michael, owned. Harrison left the grocery store parking lot and quickly went back to the station. But when he arrived, he discovered that the story surrounding the LeBaron was a lot stranger than he'd imagined. It would turn out the LeBaron had not originally been rented from Michael's company. Instead, the couple who had rented this LeBaron had apparently accidentally called Michael's company and asked where they should drop the car off when they returned it, and somebody at Michael's company, who was used to cars getting returned all the time, and so did not think to ask this couple, hey, did you rent with us or did you rent somewhere else? They just told the couple, okay, yeah, just leave the car at this specific location and leave the keys inside. Harrison didn't know what to make of this. He thought it would have been a lot more cut and dry if the car simply belonged to Michael's company, but now he needed to figure out if this was all just some bizarre coincidence that, the killers happened to drop off the car at Michael's company by accident, or if Michael, or one of his employees for that matter, had taken this opportunity to get a hold of a car that they thought would not be traced back to them. So Harrison went to interview some of Michael's employees, and he thought he found another potential suspect when he spoke to Sheila and Richard Keene, the young couple who had been at Marlene's barbecue, who had walked up to Marlene when she was at the grill and they had asked her if she was doing okay. Also the same couple that Marlene's mother-in-law had sort of warned Marlene about, saying that, Sheila was young and pretty, so be cautious of her. But Marlene was actually thinking, Sheila's not the problem, it's Richard. He's this big intimidating repo man guy. Harrison and his team dug into Sheila and Richard's background, and they would discover that Richard had a criminal record. And in virtue of him being a repo man who worked all over the area, he would know his way around the neighborhood, and he could have easily figured out a route to quickly escape Marlene's neighborhood, and he probably would have had a good idea where to abandon the getaway car where it wouldn't be found for at least a few days. But after actually meeting with Richard, Harrison couldn't find anything linking him directly to Marlene's shooting. And there was no evidence that Richard was the employee at Michael's company who had taken that call about returning the LeBaron and then told the renters where to leave it. So, over the next couple of weeks, Harrison continued to pursue leads connected to Michael and his business, but he started to feel like the answers to this case were just out of his grasp. He had a strong hunch that either Michael or someone who worked for him was behind the shooting, but the evidence just wasn't coming together. And news from the FBI did very little to point Harrison in the right direction. Test results did show that the red fibers found in the LeBaron were most likely from a wig, but the two strands of brown hair that investigators had also found could not be analyzed fully enough to identify who they belonged to. And so after all this work that Harrison and his team had done, they still basically had very little to go on. So Harrison decided to keep digging into Michael's used car dealership because he still thought the abandoned white LeBaron was the strongest clue they had. Detective Harrison and his team spent the months following Marlene's murder delving into her husband Michael's business practices at his used car dealership, and they found significant evidence of illegal activity. Now, it was nothing that tied Michael or any of his employees to Marlene's murder, but still there was way too much evidence of these other crimes for Harrison to just overlook. So on October 26, 1990, exactly 5 months after Marlene's murder, Michael was arrested on multiple charges including racketeering, auto theft, and filing false insurance claims. Michael's attorney argued that the only reason police made the arrest was because they were frustrated with their own inability to find Marlene's killer. Michael would eventually be sentenced to 4 years in prison, but during all that time, Detective Harrison did not get any closer to identifying the person who had murdered Marlene. Harrison had a strong hunch about who he thought had done it, but he didn't have the clear-cut evidence to back it up. And as more time went by, stories of the killer clown in the upscale Florida neighborhood seemed more like a strange urban legend than an active, actual homicide investigation. And eventually, the killer clown case went cold, and it would stay that way for decades. But 23 years after Marlene's murder, so in 2013, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department received a federal grant of $125,000. The grant money was to be used to help solve cold cases, and one of the very first cold cases the department reopened was Marlene's murder. The new investigators started by reviewing all of the evidence and putting the case back together piece by piece. They located and re-interviewed past suspects and witnesses, and they also tracked down Marlene's husband, Michael, who was now living in Tennessee with his new wife, a blonde woman named Debbie. But early on in the new investigation, police still could not find any evidence that pointed them in the right direction. But like Detective Harrison before them, the new investigative team could not shake the connection between Michael's used car dealership and the white Chrysler LeBaron that the clown had used as a getaway car. And they were convinced if they kept looking into that connection, they would eventually discover something that would pay off. It took a few more years, but they were right. Their method did finally pay off. In December of 2016, so over 26 years after Marlene's murder, detectives from the Palm Beach Sheriff's Department traveled to Tennessee, and they would follow local police to an establishment called the Purple Cow, a fast food burger place that Michael and his new wife Debbie owned. The investigators spoke to current employees about the couple, and everybody talked about what incredible bosses Michael and Debbie were, and what a great place the Purple Cow was to work. So the detectives left the fast food restaurant and met up with former employees of the Purple Cow, thinking maybe they would be more candid about their experience with Michael and Debbie. And inside of a small house in Tennessee, the Florida investigators met with a former Purple Cow employee who said he had all the details from an insane conversation Michael's new wife, Debbie, had had with a friend of his. The information this former employee provided about this drunken conversation led investigators to dig through photos that had been taken at the Purple Cow. And one of those photos leapt out at the investigators, and they were sure they had finally found proof of who killed Marlene. Still, investigators were not willing to put an entire case on the line with a single photograph, especially for a case that dated back almost 27 years. They wanted scientific evidence to back up their claims. So they reached out to the FBI. DNA testing and hair analysis had taken massive leaps forward since Detective Harrison's initial investigation into this case back in 1990. And so this time, when the FBI tested the 2 strands of brown hair that had been found inside of the abandoned white Chrysler LeBaron, they were able to find a clear match. And the person those tests pointed to was the same person investigators had seen in the Purple Cow photo. And that person was Marlene's killer. Based on those DNA tests, the infamous Purple Cow photo, and evidence collected across 27 years, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to Marlene Warren on the morning she was killed, May 26, 1990. On that day, so May 26th, the killer dipped a small triangle-shaped sponge into a container of clown makeup. The killer then ran the sponge across their face over and over again, painting their face white. The process took a while, but they wanted to be sure that any of their recognizable facial features disappeared under all their makeup. When they were satisfied with the makeup, the killer took a clean sponge, dipped it in red makeup, and gave themselves big red dots on their cheeks and also a wide red smile. The killer fitted a red curly wig on their head and tucked their brown hair underneath it. Then they added the final touch, a clown nose. The killer then looked in the mirror. They were sure nobody would know who they were. Finally, they picked up 2 balloons and a basket of flowers off the floor. They grabbed their .38 caliber handgun off the makeup table, and they headed out the door. At around 11 a.m., the killer clown drove a white Chrysler LeBaron past the mansions in Marlene's neighborhood. The killer was nervous, but they told themselves they had the perfect disguise, so there was nothing to worry about. The killer eventually pulled up in front of Marlene's house. There was a car that was already on the long circular driveway, so the killer parked the LeBaron on the street. The killer glanced in the rearview mirror just to make sure their costume and wig were all in place. Then they stepped out of the car and they opened up the back driver's side door. They reached inside and grabbed the balloons and flowers in one hand, and they grabbed the gun with the other. The killer clown then walked up the driveway towards the front door, hiding the gun behind the basket of flowers. The clown stepped onto the porch and slipped their gun behind their back. Then they took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. A moment later, the door opened, and the killer clown saw Marlene standing there. The killer gave a huge clown smile and handed Marlene the flowers and balloons. Marlene beamed and said, "Oh, how pretty," and then began looking through the flowers for a card to see who sent it. And it was at this point that the killer clown quickly swung their arm out from behind their back. They raised their gun up, aimed it at Marlene's head, and fired. The bullet tore through Marlene's head, and she crumpled to the floor. Screams came from inside the house, and the killer turned and ran back towards their Chrysler. Once they were inside, they hit the gas and sped off. But not long after that, they heard a car racing down the street behind them. The killer glanced in the rearview mirror and saw somebody was in pursuit. So the killer turned off Marlene's street and sped through the neighborhood and lost whoever was following them in the process. Once they were sure they were not being tailed anymore, the killer made their way across town and parked the LeBaron in a grocery store parking lot. Then they got into another car that they had stashed there and they drove off. Not long after that, the killer was back at home washing off all their makeup. The killer knew Marlene's husband, Michael, would get the news about his wife soon, and he would be very upset. But the killer just didn't worry too much about that. Now that she had gotten Marlene out of the way, all she had to do was divorce her own husband, and soon she and Michael could be together forever without having to hide it. Sheila Keene, Michael's young, pretty employee who Marlene's mother-in-law had specifically warned Marlene about, murdered Marlene. It turned out that Sheila and Michael had been having an affair. They had done their best to hide it from Marlene and Sheila's husband, but Sheila had grown tired of not being able to live the life she wanted with the man she loved. So she disguised herself as a clown to hide her identity and killed her romantic rival. Early on in Detective Harrison's investigation, so the initial investigation, he had believed he was looking for a man because of descriptions he had gotten from witnesses. But the large clown costume and thick white makeup had made it basically impossible for anyone to actually get a good look at the shooter, so no one really knew if it was a man or a woman. It was just this running assumption that it had to be a man. But eventually, Detective Harrison had stopped thinking about the various descriptions he had gotten from witnesses because he basically thought they were not reliable, and instead, he had begun to consider Sheila as a major suspect because he was almost certain she and Michael were having an affair. But there simply wasn't enough evidence at the time to credibly tie Sheila to the murder, so the case had gone cold. Decades later, when the sheriff's department reopened the case, they discovered that Michael was remarried to this blonde woman named Debbie. But when police tracked down the couple's marriage certificate, they learned that blonde-haired Debbie was actually brown-haired Sheila. Michael and Sheila had married just a few years after Michael had gotten out of prison. And so this was obviously a huge red flag for investigators. It took a while, but they eventually met with that former Purple Cow employee in Tennessee, and he would say that one night Sheila, who he knew as Debbie, had gotten totally drunk and told his friend that she had once dressed up as a clown and killed a woman in Florida. And not long after that, investigators found that infamous photo of Sheila working at the Purple Cow drive-thru wearing clown makeup. And so investigators were convinced Sheila had to be Marlene's killer, and soon the FBI confirmed that she was. They ran new tests on the brown hair that had been found in the Chrysler LeBaron, and they were able to match that hair to Sheila's hair. And so in September of 2017, over 27 years after Marlene's murder, investigators tracked Sheila down and put her under arrest. In April of 2023, Sheila pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison, but she could get out as early as the summer of 2024. Some of the investigators involved still suspect that Michael must have played a role in this murder, but there was no evidence found that linked him to the crime, and so he was never charged. Michael also maintains that despite Sheila's plea deal, she is innocent and was wrongfully accused. On Sunday, August 26, 1990, a 56-year-old woman named Patricia Powell and her husband, Frank, pulled into a parking lot outside of this beautiful 3-story white apartment building in Gainesville, Florida. Gainesville is this beautiful little town in northern Florida that is home to the massive University of Florida, which is known for their big-time football team and their big-time college party scene. Patricia and Frank's daughter, 17-year-old Christine, was going to be a freshman that year at the University of Florida. And apparently she had been so excited after getting her acceptance letter that her dad, Frank, had gone out and got a gold necklace for her that had the school's mascot, an alligator, dangling from it. And apparently Christine wore this all the time. 2 days earlier, Christine and her new roommate, 18-year-old Sonia Larson, the two had actually met over the summer when they took some summer classes together. They had actually already come to Gainesville and they had moved in to this white apartment complex that Patricia and Frank were now parked outside of. And after unpacking some of their things in their apartment, Christine and Sonia had left and gone into town and grabbed a bite to eat at a local restaurant. And then afterwards, Christine had used a payphone to call back home and tell her parents how well it was going and how much she already enjoyed her roommate and how excited she was for the year. And she told Patricia and Frank that she would call them the following day. But the following day came and went, and Patricia and Frank did not hear from their daughter. And they had no way to actually call her because she had not set up her landline in her apartment. But Patricia and Frank, they told each other that, of course, everything was fine. You know, she just got to college, she's excited, she's probably out having a good time, and she just forgot to call. And anyways, Patricia and Frank had already planned a visit to see their daughter in Gainesville the next day, which was Sunday. And so fast forward back to that Sunday, and Patricia and Frank are now parked outside of their daughter's apartment complex. They still haven't heard from her, but they're still telling themselves everything's fine, she's probably just busy. And so they get out of their car and they walk over to the building and they go through one of the front access doors that brings them into the building. They find themselves inside of this carpeted stairwell where at every level on the way up, there were doors leading off to each of the apartments. They made their way up to the second level where they knew their daughter's apartment was. And they walk up to her door, and before they even knock or turn the doorknob or anything, they notice on the door there are all these notes, these handwritten notes that have been taped all over it. And they read a couple of them, and they were notes from some of Christine and Sonia's friends on campus that apparently had tried to stop by over the last weekend, but had not been able to make contact with Christine or Sonia. And so these notes said things like, "Hey, Christine, you know, we came over to try to get you to come out with us, but you didn't come to the door, so we left without you. Sorry, you know, give us a call when you get in." And so obviously the parents are totally worried given the circumstances. They don't know where their daughter is. They've been telling themselves everything is fine, and now these notes make it seem like everything is not fine. But the parents, they keep their cool and they just start knocking on the door and calling out for their daughter. But there's no answer. And so Patricia and Frank, they start to panic at this point and they leave the carpeted stairwell. They go outside and they find a maintenance worker that works for this building. And they explain their situation with their daughter and how they can't get in touch with her. And can he please let them in to make sure she's okay? The maintenance worker said he couldn't without speaking to his manager. And so he goes to his manager, and the manager, she says that's fine, but we need to get the police involved. They need to escort us into the apartment. And so the maintenance worker calls the police and requests this escort, and a few minutes later, a single Gainesville police officer arrives at the apartment complex. And he tells Patricia and Frank that just as a precaution, I need you guys to stay outside. So they stay right outside those front access doors. They're outside of the apartment building. And then this officer, along with the maintenance worker and the manager of the building, those three, they go inside the stairwell. They go up to the second floor. And at that point, the maintenance worker gets out his keys. He finds the right one, and he opens Christine and Sonia's door. The door swings open, and immediately the police officer yells out for the two girls, but there's no answer. And so the officer is first into the apartment, which basically immediately opens up to their living room. And in the middle of the living room is a couch that's angled towards the right side of the room where a TV had been set up. And so the officer, again, as he walks in, he's calling out, trying to get the girl's attention, but there's no answer. Behind him is the maintenance worker and the building manager, and they begin making their way towards the right side of the living room, over towards that TV, to see if maybe someone was laying on the couch. And as they round that corner and can finally actually see the front of the couch, the maintenance worker, after seeing what he saw, screams out and runs out of the apartment. He runs down the stairs, out the access doors, and begins vomiting on the grass and sobbing right next to Frank and Patricia. Naturally, Frank and Patricia, after seeing this, are immediately concerned that something's wrong with their daughter. And so they run inside, they go up the stairs, and they start running into the apartment. And the police officer and the building manager, they try to stop them from getting in, but there was nothing stopping them. They managed to push past those two. They get into the living room and they're calling out for their daughter. And eventually they make their way over to the side of the couch and they see their daughter, Christine. She is lying on the ground in front of the couch. She's on her back. She has no clothes on. And she's been stabbed to death. And whoever has killed her has positioned her in this very suggestive, sexual, lewd position, as if they were trying to demean her as much as possible and shock whoever found her. And so after these totally devastated and wrecked parents are escorted out of the apartment, this one police officer, he continues searching the apartment. And so he searches the rest of the first floor. There's no sign of Sonia. He goes upstairs and he finds Sonia. She's laying on her bed. She also has no clothes on. She's been stabbed to death and she's positioned on the side of the bed in a sort of suggestive, lewd position, much like Christine downstairs. It would later be determined that Christine had been sexually assaulted, but Sonia had not been. The officer at this point leaves the apartment. He goes outside. He walks past the grieving parents who are being consoled by the building manager and the maintenance worker. And the officer goes over to his car and he uses his radio to call in for backup. A forensics team comes out to the apartment and they begin processing the scene. And right away, they discover on the outside of the door frame of the door leading into the apartment, there were markings on the edge that looked like someone had used a screwdriver or some similar instrument to pop open the door. They also found there was a towel and some soap that was lying on the ground near Christine's body and near the couch that had apparently been used to both clean Christine's body and also clean some other parts of the apartment. And so they believe this was done to try to intentionally destroy evidence, suggesting the killer or killers were somewhat sophisticated. They also discovered there was some residue on Christine's wrists that indicated at some point her hands had been bound by duct tape. But when she was found, her hands were not bound and there was no duct tape from her wrists. And so whoever had done this had at some point removed the duct tape and taken it away. And so investigators believed that the killer or killers had used the duct tape to immobilize Christine for the attack. And then after she was deceased, they had removed that tape in order to be able to get her arms up over her head, which seemed to increase the shock value of this lewd position they had put her in. Based on what they saw inside of this apartment, the police were convinced they were up against a group of killers or a killer that had targeted these two girls. That this was not some random attack, that this was calculated, this was on purpose, and if they didn't get caught, they were going to strike again. And so even though the police really didn't have any leads to operate on, they just had this crime scene and they were looking for maybe someone with duct tape and a knife and a screwdriver. I mean, that was really about it at this point. And so even though they have virtually nothing, because there were thousands and thousands of young people flooding Gainesville for the start of the new school year at the University of Florida, literally the following day, Monday, classes were starting. Because of all these young people in town, the police felt it was very important that they got the media to put out a bulletin to all these people in town that there was potentially a killer or killers on the loose. And so that night, Sunday evening, this news bulletin goes out and it basically just told residents of Gainesville to stay indoors and stay in groups. And if you needed to go outside, travel in groups and just overall stay vigilant until we figure out who did this. 12 hours before Christine Powell and Sonia Larson were discovered, an 18-year-old Gainesville woman named Krista Hoyt did not show up for work. Krista was a student at Santa Fe Community College, which was right down the road from the University of Florida. That year, she was planning to transfer to the University of Florida, and then after graduation, she wanted to pursue a career in forensics with the FBI. And so given her interest in law enforcement, while she was a student, she had gotten a part-time job working in the records department of the sheriff's office. And apparently, at this sheriff's office, she was famous for always coming to work, no matter what, including the time that she got her wisdom teeth removed, and then an hour after coming home, she showed up for work. And so on this Saturday night, when Krista was supposed to be showing up for work and she didn't call ahead, and no one could get in touch with her on her landline, everybody at the sheriff's office was really concerned. And so they waited around for about an hour, hoping that she might just show up with some story about why she was late, but she never showed up. She didn't call. They still couldn't get in touch with her. And so in the very early hours of Sunday morning, the sheriff's office called the Gainesville police and asked them to do a welfare check on Krista. And so 2 police officers from the Gainesville Police Department, they show up at the apartment belonging to Krista Hoyt. Krista lived alone, and she lived about 2 miles away from Christine Powell and Sonia Larson. And so these 2 officers, they get there and they walk up to the front door and they knock, but there's no answer. And they try the doorknob, it's locked. And so one of the officers walks around to the back of this apartment and he sees there's a glass sliding door. And so he knocks on the glass sliding door, there's no answer. He tries the door, it's locked. And then he notices the drape that's inside the apartment that's covering up this sliding glass door. It reaches almost to the ground, but not all the way. There's a couple of inches on the bottom where if you were laying on the ground, you could actually look through this little space and see into the apartment. And so that's what he does. He lies down and he puts his flashlight up and he looks through this couple inch gap on this window. And as soon as the light illuminates what's inside of this apartment, he finds Krista. Krista is sitting on the edge of a bed that's not that far away from the sliding glass door, and she's facing the door. She's kind of hunched over at the edge of the bed. She's got no clothes on, and she's got stab marks all over her back, and she's missing her head. And her head was next to the bed to the left, up on the shelf, and it was positioned in such a way that it almost appeared like the head was looking down at the detached body. When this crime scene was processed, the forensics team immediately noticed there were marks on the back sliding glass door where someone had used probably a screwdriver or something similar to pop the door open. And then they also found residue of duct tape on Krista's wrists, but the duct tape was gone. She was found with her hands not bound. It would later be determined that Krista had been sexually assaulted before she had been murdered. The obvious similarities between Krista's crime scene and Christine and Sonia's crime scene were initially only recognized by Gainesville police because much of the information about the 2 crime scenes was not public. But that night, Sunday evening, when the police went to the media and asked them to put out that bulletin to all Gainesville residents to say that there could be a killer or killers on the loose, it didn't take long for residents of Gainesville and news anchors to begin speculating that you have these 2 murders that have happened really close together physically. They're less than 2 miles apart, and they've probably occurred within the last 24, 48 hours. So they've happened in rapid succession. They're both unsolved. And so even without intimate details of the crime scene, it wasn't hard to say, I think these 2 are probably connected. And so that night, Sunday evening, Gainesville really went into a state of panic. And within hours of this news, you had stores all over Gainesville that had sold out their deadbolts and locks, their mace, their stun guns, their baseball bats, their actual guns, their knives. I mean, people were really trying to arm themselves to protect themselves against this unknown threat that was murdering students in Gainesville. And the police, even though they did not come out and substantiate the claims that, perhaps these 2 homicides are connected, they did believe they were. And so that night, Sunday night, as all this chaos is kind of unfolding in town, the police put hundreds of officers all over the place, on foot on every street corner. They had police cars and trucks parked all over the place. I mean, the entire town was on an extreme heightened alert because the police believed another attack was imminent. And so all they could do was try to come out in force to try to discourage the killer or killers from striking again. But as it would turn out, it didn't work. By the following morning, so Monday morning, what was happening in Gainesville had gone from just being a Florida story to a national story, and everybody all over the country was talking about it. And one woman named Lisa Byers, who was in her 20s, she did not live in Gainesville, but she had a very close friend who did. She was 23-year-old Tracy Paulus. Tracy had taken some years off from college, but that year had decided to go back and give it another go. And so she was enrolled at the University of Florida. And so Lisa called Tracy and said, hey, I'm watching the news. This is crazy what's happening in your town. How are you holding up? And Tracy would tell her that, I'm just as concerned as everybody else. It's terrifying to think there are killer or killers on the loose, but I think I'm okay because I have my roommate. Tracy's roommate was 23-year-old Manny Taboda, who was this big, strong former football player who was very close with Tracy. The 2 had never dated, but they had been very good friends for a number of years. And he too had taken some time off of school and had agreed to go back because Tracy had convinced him, come back, get your degree with me and we'll live together. And so when the news broke about these killings happening in their town, Manny had told Tracy that he would protect her, that nothing would happen to her. And so when Lisa heard this from Tracy, that she thought that she was okay because she has Manny and, he'll look after her, and they were not planning to really leave the apartment much besides classes, Lisa was reassured, but she was still worried. And so she told Tracy, please give me a call this evening after you come back from classes just to let me know that everything is okay. And so Tracy said she would, and then they hung up. And then that evening, Tracy did not call Lisa back. So Lisa tried calling Tracy, but no one picked up. And so that night, Lisa went to bed. She was very worried, but she went to sleep. And then early the next morning, which was Tuesday morning, she tried calling Tracy again, but there was no answer. And so Lisa reached out to a mutual friend of theirs that lived in the same apartment complex in Gainesville. His name was Tommy. And so she asked Tommy, can you please go over to Tracy's apartment and make sure she and Manny are okay? And so Tommy said, no problem. I'll give you a call from Tracy's landline once I talk to her. And so about 5 minutes later, Tracy got a call. She picked it up, and it was Tommy calling from Tracy's landline, and he was just screaming. When the police arrived at Tracy's apartment, they found Tracy in her bedroom, and like the other victims, she had no clothes on. She was positioned on the side of the bed in a very suggestive, lewd position. She had been stabbed to death, and it would turn out she had been sexually assaulted. And then down the hall from Tracy, they found Manny. He was in his bed, and he too had been stabbed to death. Except he had his clothes on and he was not positioned in a suggestive position. He had kind of died wherever he was, and that was the position they found him in. The forensics team, when they processed the scene, they found markings on the outside of the back sliding door where it looked like someone had used a screwdriver to pop open the door. And then on Tracy's wrists, they found that residue from duct tape, but there was no duct tape. It had been removed. At this point, to the police, it was undeniable that they were up against a serial killer or killers. And when the news broke that there was now a fourth and fifth victim, and they were both college students, and one of them was now this big strapping man that apparently was taken down just as easily as these other four petite women, this threw Gainesville into an absolute state of pandemonium. Suddenly, it felt like no one could protect them. The people in Gainesville, they were fair game. It didn't matter that police were out in force in the streets, and you had people walking around with guns and baseball bats and mace, and you had people locking their doors and sleeping in groups. It was like no measures were actually stopping these killings from happening. Whoever was doing it was killing with impunity. And so that day, Tuesday, you had hundreds and hundreds of students from the University of Florida just leaving the school who just didn't come back. And as for the police, they called in the FBI and the National Guard. And so by that night, Tuesday night, there were literally hundreds of officers and state police officers all over the place. There were helicopters overhead, both police helicopters and news helicopters with spotlights. They had National Guard military-style trucks all over the place. And so Gainesville was really at the highest alert you could possibly be on. But even still, the people of Gainesville, they were not going to feel safe until the police made an arrest. And the next day, just 24 hours after Tracy and Manny had been found, the police did just that. After receiving dozens and dozens of tips about one particular individual, they were able to arrest 19-year-old Ed Humphreys, who was a freshman at the University of Florida. They arrested him for domestic abuse because he had actually struck his grandmother in the face. And so they pick him up for domestic abuse, but they set his bail at a whopping $1 million, which is way higher than you would normally expect for a domestic abuse charge. But this was a unique circumstance where he was being arrested for one thing, but really he was being looked at as the suspect of these 5 homicides. And so the police really needed him to stay behind bars. And this massive bail, that did that. He had no way to pay it. And so while Ed was behind bars, the police began investigating him, and they found there was a lot of reasons to believe he was the serial killer. He had shown he was willing to be violent because, after all, he punched his grandmother in the face. And people that knew him said he was totally mentally unstable and that he hated women and that he would walk around with a knife on his belt basically all the time. And at night, he was known to walk around the forest of Gainesville. There were these very thick forests that kind of butted up against the University of Florida, and he would walk through the forest at night, which put him very close to the different apartment buildings where all the victims were found. And on top of all that, Ed Humphreys just looked like what you would imagine a serial killer would look like. He had all these deep scars all over his face, and his eyes looked totally hollow, like he was permanently on drugs, and he was seen smiling at the cameras when he was led in and out of the courtroom. And to make him even more suspicious, as soon as he was arrested, the attack stopped. There were no more slayings in Gainesville. And so naturally, the country believed Ed was the guy. Basically, everyone thought Ed was the guy. But it came back that his blood type was type A, and the killer or killer's blood type, the blood that had been found at the various crime scenes, was type B. Now, this did not clear Ed of guilt because people believed there was a chance that, he could have been involved in some way. Perhaps he had an accomplice or multiple accomplices. But when this news broke, pretty much everybody was back on edge because clearly there's at least one or more killers that are still on the loose. Shortly after this blood type discrepancy presented itself, the FBI approached the Gainesville police and said, hey, why don't you use our VCAP program? VCAP stands for Violent Crime Apprehension Program. And what it was this computer program where it allowed investigators to input details of their crime they were investigating. And when they submitted it, it would be compared against this huge database of other crimes in the country. And if there were any similarities with any other crime, those similar crimes would get popped on screen. And so when the Gainesville police input the information from these 5 student slayings in Gainesville, the computer program spit out a single match. It was from an unsolved triple homicide in 1989 in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is a town located about 800 miles to the northwest of Gainesville. Shreveport, back in the late 1980s, was considered so safe by its residents that many of them didn't lock their front doors and they would leave their car keys just sitting on their front dash. But in 1989, that would all change. On Friday, November 3rd of that year, 8-year-old Sean Grissom was dropped off at his grandfather's house in Shreveport. He was there to celebrate his 8th birthday. And so his grandfather was this 56-year-old man named Tom who was divorced, and he was getting ready to retire soon, and he was also trying to spend more time with his grandson. And so he was very excited about having Sean over. Also staying at this house with Sean and his grandfather was Sean's aunt, 24-year-old Julie Grissom, who was a college student. She was attending Louisiana State University in Shreveport. When Sean was dropped off by his mother at his grandfather's house, the grandfather, Tom, yelled out to the boy's mother and said, I'll have him back by Monday. I'll drop him off, see you later. And so Sean's mother, she leaves, and that day and the following day, she doesn't hear from Sean's grandfather or from Julie. And so come Sunday night, she tries calling them to, see what's going on. She knows they're having a great time and doesn't really want to interrupt them, but she also hasn't heard from them, but they don't pick up. She convinces herself that everything is just fine, that I'm sure there's an explanation. They're probably just having a great time. They don't want to call me. And so she ends up going to bed. And so the next morning, Monday morning, when Sean is supposed to be dropped off early enough that she can take him to school, when he doesn't show up, the mother calls the grandfather back and tries to get in touch and figure out what's going on, but she can't get in touch with him. And so she's telling herself that, okay, well, his grandfather must have just dropped him off at school. And so the mother calls Sean's school, and the school says, no, we have not seen Sean today, and we haven't heard from him, so we don't know what's going on. And so now Sean's mother is terrified. She calls the police, and the police actually get in touch with the neighbor of Tom Grissom, and they ask this neighbor, hey, can you go next door and just make sure Tom and Sean and Julie are okay? And so this neighbor says, no problem. They leave their house, and immediately they notice, as they're looking at Tom's house, that the 2 cars in the driveway had not left since Friday. It was just something the neighbor noticed. And then they also noticed that there were 2 newspapers at the end of the driveway. It was the Monday and Sunday paper. And they knew Tom always read the newspaper. And so the idea that he would just leave them sitting at the end of the driveway, that didn't really add up. And so the neighbor walks around to the front door and they notice there are lights on inside, and they knock on the front door, but there's no answer. They try the front door, but it's locked. And so they end up going around to the very back of the house, and they're able to get into the house through the garage. And then through the garage, they open another door that leads into the main part of the house. And this neighbor, they immediately see on the ground towards the back door near the kitchen is Tom. He's laying on the ground and he's obviously deceased. And so this neighbor, they run out, they call the police come back over, they go inside the house, and sure enough, they find Tom Grissom has been stabbed to death. He's laying on the ground near the back door. They find Sean Grissom, the 8-year-old, he's slouched over on the couch in front of the TV, and he's been stabbed to death as well. And then upstairs, they found 24-year-old Julie, the aunt, and she was positioned on the edge of the bed in this very suggestive way. She had no clothes on, and she had been stabbed to death, and it would later be determined she had also been sexually assaulted before she was killed. And they also discovered there's vinegar on her body, as if whoever's done this has attempted to clean her with vinegar. There was no sign of a robbery in the house or ransacking in the house. There was no sign of forced entry. Overall, the investigators said this was a very neat crime scene, as if whoever did this had done this with great intentionality. And so after kind of going through the crime scene, the police really didn't have any leads to go off of. And so this crime went unsolved. And so as these Gainesville police are looking at this report in this VCAP computer system, and they're reading about this unsolved triple homicide, all they can think about is how unbelievably similar the crime scene was to all the crime scenes of the student slayings. Specifically, that Julie had been arranged in this kind of suggestive pose like the other female victims in Gainesville. And on top of that, it was determined that the blood type of the killer in Shreveport was type B, same as the killer or killers in Gainesville. So there was a match in the blood type. Somehow, after this discovery through this VCAP program, the media found out about this Shreveport unsolved triple homicide and how apparently it was incredibly similar to all these slayings that have taken place in Gainesville. And so before long, that was all every news network all over the United States was talking about. And at first, the police in Gainesville and anybody involved in this investigation was very upset about this because one, they probably had a leak that someone was giving information to the press, but two, the press was kind of jeopardizing their investigation because by having these details leaked, the killer or killers could potentially benefit from kind of knowing what the police were thinking about and what they were up to. But as it would turn out, this particular leak would prove to be quite fruitful. Shortly after this news about the Shreveport killing and the student slayings was all over the news, this woman named Cindy, who lived in Shreveport, she called the police after watching all the news like everybody else and told the police they really ought to look at this guy Danny Rawling. Danny Rawling was this 37-year-old drifter who was in Shreveport at the time of the Grissom family murders in 1989, and apparently after those murders, he had told Cindy's husband that he, quote, had a problem, and his problem was he liked stabbing people. And Danny literally always walked around with a huge knife on his waist. He seemed totally mentally unstable. And so this claim that he liked stabbing people, Cindy and her husband took literally and basically told him to stay away from them. And so in one of their last conversations with Danny, Danny actually told Cindy that he planned to leave Shreveport and go someplace where there's lots of beautiful young women that he can just stare at all day long. And so when police asked Cindy, do you think he's capable of killing all 8 of these people? She said, oh yeah. And so the police turned their attention to Danny and began researching his background, and they discovered he was raised in a very abusive household. Specifically, his father really couldn't stand him. They had a really bad relationship. And then when Danny got old enough, he joined the Air Force, but he was kicked out after 2 years for being mentally unstable. And once he was discharged, he began the string of armed robberies in the 1980s, and he eventually got caught and spent the bulk of the 1980s in prison. And then in 1989, when he got out of prison, he came back to Shreveport and moved in with his parents. Now, this was not a happy homecoming. His parents did not want him living with them, but Danny kind of forced the issue. He had nowhere else to go, and so he wound up living there. And as it happened, they lived less than a half-mile away from the Grissom family home. 6 months after the Grissom family was murdered, and 3 months before the Gainesville student slayings had begun, Danny gets in this huge fight with his father, where his father actually draws a pistol and forces Danny to leave the house and tells him to never come back. And so Danny, he runs out of the house and he gets his gun from his vehicle, comes back inside his house and shoots his father point blank in the head and then in the stomach before fleeing the scene. His father would amazingly survive this attack despite some pretty significant damage to his head, and he would tell the police, and before long there was a warrant for Danny's arrest for attempted murder. But when they went to go arrest him, he was gone. They had no idea where he went. And so as the Gainesville police are looking at Danny's criminal record, they're starting to say to themselves that this guy looks really interesting. He does seem like he could be the serial killer we're looking for. And so as they continue to dig deeper and deeper, one of the Gainesville police officers suddenly thinks of something. There was this unsolved armed robbery of this bank in Gainesville that happened the same week where all 5 of the students had been killed. A lone masked gunman walked into this bank in broad daylight and demanded money from the teller, and the teller, who thought on their feet, gave him the cash, but it was the type that was booby-trapped with dye packets, meaning if this robber tried to tamper with the money at all, it would detonate, sending dye all over them and kind of making it obvious that this money had been stolen. But the robber doesn't see this. He takes the bag of cash, he leaves the bank and manages to flee and go into the forest before the police show up. And so the police ultimately, they go and search the forest and they find this campsite deep in the woods. And at this campsite, which is abandoned, they don't find the person who robbed the bank, but at this campsite, they find the bag that has the money inside of it, and the dye packet has been activated. So clearly the robber had tried to fiddle with it, and then when it detonated, they had taken off and left the money. And then also at this campsite, near this duffel bag full of ruined money, was a screwdriver, a gun, and an audio recorder. Now, at the time, the police that were seeing this, they were part of this huge effort in Gainesville to stop any more attacks on students and catch the killer or killers. That was all they were thinking about. And so when they didn't immediately catch this robber, they kind of said, you know what? This is a lower priority item than what we're dealing with this loose serial killer or killers. And so let's just round up the evidence, put it in storage, and somebody else can deal with this after we handle this killer situation. And so no one listened to the audio recording. They just put it in evidence. They grabbed everything else, put it in evidence, and they threw it in the storage room. And so now this Gainesville police officer that's just remembered this unsolved armed robbery, he says to the group that's investigating Danny, he says, hey, since Danny has a penchant for armed robbery, clearly he has a rap sheet full of armed robberies, maybe if he was the serial killer and he killed all these students, that would have meant he was in Gainesville, and so maybe he committed this armed robbery. And so we should go look at the evidence and listen to that tape. And so the officers, they practically run to the storage locker. They get the evidence from this unsolved armed robbery. They come back and they hit play on this audio recorder. And what they hear is unbelievable. They hear on this recording a man singing a song. It's clearly a song he wrote, and he's singing about being a, quote, mystery killer. And then it kind of segues into him talking about how to effectively kill a deer with a knife, to be really effective with a knife. And he's getting into really graphic detail of how to do that. And then, somewhat unbelievably, on this audio recording, the man identifies himself. He says his name is Danny Rawling. And so this audio recording was huge. It meant Danny Rawling, the guy they're looking at as potentially being the serial killer, was definitely in Gainesville, in the woods near the University of Florida, the same time frame that all of the victims were killed. Also, the screwdriver that had been found at this campsite matched the markings that had been made along the outside of some of the door frames of the victims' homes. They also went into Danny's military records, and it showed he had a blood type of B. So his blood type matched the blood type that had been found in all of the victims' homes. And so just like that, Danny became the number one suspect. And when they went to figure out where he was, amazingly, they found he was already in custody. He was being held in a jail cell 40 miles south of Gainesville for another armed robbery. And so immediately, Danny was charged in the murders of the 5 Gainesville students. They couldn't charge him for the 3 Shreveport murders because they just didn't have enough evidence. And then after that, Danny was transferred to Florida's maximum security prison to await trial. Initially, Danny said he was innocent, he had nothing to do with the murders, but then almost 4 years later, when his trial was finally starting on the first day of his trial, he surprised everyone in the court when he stood up and said, "I'm going to change my plea. I'm guilty on all 5 counts. I did kill all 5 students." He would tell the court the reason he did this is he wanted to be a superstar like the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy, who he looked up to. Danny would also, at another date, confess to killing the 3 Grissom family members in Shreveport. Because of Danny's detailed confessions, we now know all the terrifying details of what actually happened when he killed all 8 of his victims. Back on Friday, November 3rd, 1989, Danny was fired from his job as a waiter at a local restaurant in Shreveport. And so he was frustrated, he was angry, and he was kind of walking around his neighborhood when he decided the way he would kind of channel his frustration was he would go kill some people. And so he was armed with his K-bar knife, which he always carried with him. And he found himself standing in front of this little house, and he saw some people moving around inside. And he looked around, there wasn't anyone watching him. And so he just walked up to the front door. He tried the handle and it was unlocked. And so before he opened the door, he made sure his knife was in hand. He opened the door, walked right in, and he saw Sean, the 8-year-old, sitting on the couch watching TV. And without any hesitation, he walked up behind him and stabbed him through the back, killing him almost instantly. And then Danny walked into the kitchen where he found Tom, the grandfather, who was making steaks out on the back grill. And so he was going back and forth between the kitchen and the grill, kind of getting ready for dinner. And at some point, when Tom came back into the house and was holding steaks in his hand, Danny leapt out and stabbed him. And even though Tom put up a fight, he was very quickly subdued as well. And then after that, Danny made his way upstairs where Julie was, that was Sean's aunt, and she was getting ready for a wedding she was going to attend that night for one of her friends. And so she had just gotten out of her shower and she was getting ready to put on this red dress she had picked out, and Danny walked into her room and she most likely saw him, at which point Danny would have told her what he had just done to her loved ones downstairs, and he threatened her with the knife and said, if you don't listen to me, I'm going to do the same thing to you. And because she was terrified, she listened to him, and so he immobilized her, and then he sexually assaulted her, and then he stabbed her to death. Afterwards, he cuts the tape off of her wrists and puts the tape in his pocket, and then he lays her out on her back on her bed, and then he goes downstairs and gets some vinegar and uses the vinegar to attempt to clean her body, to destroy any evidence he might have left behind. And then after cleaning her, he kind of puts her in that lewd, suggestive pose with her hands up over her head and her legs spread, and then he leaves. 6 months later, in August of 1990, after Danny has shot his father and is on the run from the law, he finds himself in Gainesville, Florida, and he sets up this little camp just behind the University of Florida in this thick forest. And then on Friday, August 23rd, as he's sitting out at his campsite, he gets this sudden urge to go kill again. And so he waits for it to get dark out, and then he gets out his audio recorder and he records himself alluding to this murder he is about to go perpetrate. Then, armed with a pistol, a screwdriver, and his K-bar knife, he left his campsite and walked in the darkness in the forest about a mile away until he was looking from inside the forest out towards this 3-story white apartment building. And it's believed that within the last 24 hours, he had been in that area and he had seen 2 young girls go in and out of this apartment building, and that was all he needed to determine who his victims were going to be. And so those victims were Christine Powell and Sonia Larson. And so when he was standing in front of their apartment building, he eventually strode out of the forest. He walked up to that access door that led him into that stairwell. He made his way up to the door of Christine and Sonia, and he used his screwdriver to pop the door open. He went inside and shut the door behind him and walked into the living room, and he found Christine was sleeping on the couch. And so he left her be. He didn't touch her. He went upstairs and he found Sonia sleeping on her bed. And so as he's standing there, realizing that he has these 2 girls, he needs to make a decision about which one he's going to kill first and which one he's going to sexually assault. And so as he's standing there looking over Sonia's bed, he decides he's going to kill Sonia and then he's going to sexually assault Christine. And so very casually, he walks into Sonia's room. She's fast asleep. She's on her back. And he pulls out a piece of duct tape. And he gets the duct tape in one hand and he pulls his knife out in the other. And he presses the duct tape over her mouth, which wakes her up. And then he drives the knife into her chest. And so Sonia would put up a pretty incredible fight, but ultimately she would succumb to her injuries. And then after she was dead, Danny just left her where she was. And he went downstairs and he found Christine was still asleep on the couch. She had not woken up from the commotion upstairs. And so he walked right in front of her, and standing over her with his knife, he kind of nudged her awake. And when she woke up, he had a piece of tape, he put it over her mouth, and he told her to be quiet and held up the knife and told her that I just killed your roommate, and if you don't listen to what I'm going to say, I'm going to kill you too. And so naturally, she complied to what he wanted, and so she let her wrists be tied, and then at that point, he cut her clothes off, he sexually assaulted her, and then he stabbed her to death. And so after she was dead on the ground, he went and got that towel and that soap, and he began cleaning Christine's body to try to remove any evidence he might have left behind. And then he cut the duct tape off of her wrist and removed the duct tape from her mouth and put those in his pocket. And then he positioned her in that kind of lewd, suggestive position that she was found in. And then Danny went back upstairs and cut the clothes off of Sonia and then positioned her on the side of the bed in a suggestive position as well. And then Danny leaves the apartment. So he goes back into the woods. He walks in the wood line back to his campsite. But when he got there, he was just too jacked up. He was too excited from what he had just done that he just couldn't control himself. All he wanted to do was go out and kill again. And so he managed to sit at his campsite for a total of 8 hours before he couldn't help it any longer. He had to go back out and find another victim. And so his next victim, he decided, would be this woman he just happened to see a couple of days ago. He was walking down the road near this row of apartments near the school, and he looked into one of them, and he just saw there was this girl in this apartment, and he just thought for a second, I bet she lives alone there. But that was the entire interaction. He didn't know this person. He was just kind of guessing that she might be alone in there. And so here he is in the forest after killing these two teens, and he's like, okay, I'm going to go back to that apartment because I think that woman is alone. And that woman would be Krista Hoyt. And so in the early morning hours of Saturday, August 24th, Danny leaves his campsite with his screwdriver, his gun, and his K-bar knife, and he walks about a half mile away from his campsite until he's still in the woods, but he's looking out at the back of Krista's apartment. And then at some point, he walks out of the forest, he walks right up over her fence and gets up to her back sliding door. He uses his screwdriver to pop the sliding door open. He slides it open, he steps inside, and he finds out that Krista is actually not in her apartment. There's no one in her apartment. But instead of leaving and finding another victim, he decides he'll just wait for Krista. And so he shuts the sliding back door and he goes into her bedroom closet and shuts the closet and then just waits. And he stays in her closet for several hours until around 11 a.m. that morning. Krista comes home, and when she was in the house, he waited a little bit longer to make sure she didn't know he was there. And then at some point, he kind of slipped out of the closet, snuck up behind her, and put her in a chokehold. Now, at first, Krista tried to fight back, but eventually she realized she could not overpower whoever this was. And at that point, she said, okay, what do you want? And Danny would tell her, you got to listen to me or I'm going to kill you. And he showed her the knife. And so Krista said, okay. And she put her wrists out. He taped her wrists with duct tape. He put tape over her mouth. And then he brought her into her bedroom where he cut her clothes off and sexually assaulted her. And then afterwards, he stabbed her to death. Once she was dead, he cut the duct tape off of her wrists and pulled the duct tape off of her mouth and put that duct tape in his pocket. And then he positioned her body on the bed in a suggestive position before he left. When he got back to his campsite, he realized he had accidentally left his wallet in Krista's apartment. And so, calm as can be, he walked back through the forest, right back into Krista's apartment. He found his wallet and he was about to leave when he thought to himself, well, wait a minute, I should mutilate her body. And so he pulled Krista's body off of the bed, and using his knife, he decapitated her. He put her head up on the shelf next to the bed, and then he repositioned her body on the edge of the bed, making it seem like she was kind of hunched over, looking out the back door. And then before he left, he reached up and twisted her decapitated head and made it seem like it was looking down at the rest of her body. 48 hours later, on the evening of Monday, August 27th, Danny was back at his campsite out in the woods, and he suddenly got the urge to go kill again. And so he stood up, he grabbed his knife, his screwdriver, and his gun, and he walked away from camp, made it about a mile through the woods until he was standing still in the forest, looking out at this big apartment complex that was very commonly occupied by college students. And so at some point, he leaves the forest and walks up to the first apartment he sees. He has no idea who's going to be in there, and he goes up to their sliding back glass door. He gets his screwdriver out and he pops it open. He slides the door open, he steps inside, and the first thing he sees is Manny Taboda, this big, strong former football player who's laying in his bed. And Danny just walks over and starts stabbing him, and Manny wakes up and puts up one heck of a fight, but ultimately Danny is able to overpower him and kills him. While Danny was stabbing Manny, the other resident inside of this apartment, 23-year-old Tracy Paulus, she was in the shower, and so she gets out of the shower and she hears all this commotion down the hall, and so she steps into the hall and she looks into Manny's room and she sees Danny on top of him stabbing him. And so Danny looks back, he sees Tracy screams, she runs down the hall into her bedroom, she slams the door behind her, she locks it, and then she leans up against the door to try to keep it shut. Meanwhile, Danny just continues to stab Manny until Manny is dead. And then Danny stands up and he just walks down the hall, calm as can be. He gets to the bedroom door where he knows Tracy is. She's trapped, she can't go anywhere. And he begins to smash the door down. He's ramming it with his shoulder, he's kicking it over and over again, and Tracy's screaming for him to stop. But eventually, he manages to just kick the door down. And as soon as he's inside the room, Tracy kind of stands back and she says to Danny, "Are you the one?" And Danny looks at her and says, "Yes, I am the one." And then he threatened her with the knife and said, "I'll kill you just like the guy down the hall unless you listen to me." And so Tracy listened. She got her wrists bound and her face bound. And then Danny cut the clothes off of her and then sexually assaulted her. And then he stabbed her to death. and then after she was dead, he cut the duct tape off of her wrists and removed the duct tape from her mouth, and then positioned her body in a suggestive sexual position on the edge of the bed, and then he left. Later that day, Danny would rob that bank in Gainesville, and then 1 month later, Danny would be arrested for a botched armed robbery 40 miles south of Gainesville, and then while he was in prison, he would find out he was being charged with the 5 murders in Gainesville. 16 years later, at 6 p.m. on October 25th, 2006, Danny Rawling was led into the execution chamber in Florida State Prison. He offered no apology to the family members of his victims that were on the other side of the glass. Instead, Danny just sang a religious hymn to himself in order to comfort himself, and then 13 minutes later, Danny was pronounced dead. He was executed via lethal injection. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't done this already, please hide outside of the 5-star review button's house when they're watching Game 7 of the World Series. And every time the game starts to get really good, change the channel using your universal remote. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen's podcast on Spotify, iTunes, Google, Amazon, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can send me a direct message on any major social media